Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 85th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. And this month in April, we are looking at personal development. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Black beauty. And that's not to say that Black communities need to focus on this as personal development, but more for people who don't understand the stereotypes, pushbacks, and the struggles around Black beauty and the pressure that there are on Black women. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Rochelle Roe Wiseman. She's a British writer and a historian of gender, race, and the body. She obtained her PhD in history from the University of Essex in 2010, where she helped pioneer interest in the history of beauty and beauty culture, now an established research area there. She is published in the Radical History Review, Gender and History, and other journals. Rochelle's career in higher education includes teaching history and leading major programs of learning and development at Essex, Exeter, London universities, and at University College London, where she now focuses on leadership development, and we've worked together on the Emerging Leaders Programme for global majority staff. Her first book, Imagining Caribbean Womanhood, tells a feminist history of Black beauty spanning the British West Indies, Harlem, and post-war London, and is published by Manchester University Press. Her current research interests centre on Black Victorian women. From this work, an exploration of Black Victorian women and beauty in the Age of Empire is to be published in a multi-volume collection by Bloomsbury, The Cultural History of Beauty. So I'm so looking forward to this chat. Rochelle, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you, Layla. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you would have heard me reading your intro, and it's fascinating. We're so excited that you're here. And I just wanted to start off by asking you, how did you come to research beauty in the Caribbean, Black beauty ideals, and the work that you're doing now?
I came to be curious about the history of Black beauty through my love of history that I've always had. And then the discovery I made as an undergraduate at university that you really could explore, Black history. I'd grown up with a sense of Black history, but it had never been part of my formal education, I suppose. And so getting to university and discovering that with great grit and determination, you could actually carve out other areas of your interest, and that there were historians, perhaps not immediately where I was, but there were historians in the world who had these broader interests in the history of, marginalized communities and Black history. And I got heavily into that and began to sort of, just follow my curiosity about, I suppose my research project began as a project about my grandmother's generation, the Windrush settlers in Britain, and how important style and grooming practices were to them. But then when I was fortunate enough to get funding for my doctoral research, so fast forward a number of years, I've always had this abiding interest. But then at the start of my PhD, I was researching those sorts of themes and found that there was a huge amount to be researched in the Caribbean itself, kind of following the trail of my grandparents who came to this country in the 60s. I sort of followed their trail back to the Caribbean itself and discovered all of these archives full of a history of beauty competitions and lots of beauty ephemera. And it resulted in my book, which is Imagining Caribbean Womanhood. And that is essentially a history of the identity projects that were embarked upon in the Caribbean around the time of the end of empire, where people became really focused on beauty competitions as a means of trying to project an idea of the nation as modern and all of these other desirable traits as well.
It's fascinating. And we've talked, haven't we, about Claudia Jones, and you, of course, were a guest on the British Library podcast, Unfinished Business. So please check that out, people. Pants, Pageants and Protests with the wonderful Ade Hassan from Nubian Skin. And you were talking more about race, beauty and feminism. And given the work that you've done in your book, how do you think things in the last year have changed and shifted around Black beauty, identity, women, etc., if at all?
Gosh, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? We could talk a lot about that.
Yeah, it's
I
a
don't
big
know
question.
how you feel. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, but it won't surprise you to know I have a kind of a healthy cynicism about how much things have really shifted. I mean, I'm an avid consumer of magazines and things like that, and I've seen a big shift there in terms of our visibility as women of colour. In those kinds of media. I don't know how long it will last, but it's a bit of a revelation for me to read about like black hair care in mainstream magazines and stuff. That's a bit of a trip. I'm like, oh, okay. But my cynicism is born of an element of sort of self-protection. I listen to a lot of great podcasts, and there's been a lot of discussion around like how, particularly in the States, there was a reaction to Black Lives Matter from a lot of white people who were suddenly newly alert to the crisis, but were a bit like, oh, well, let's get this sorted. And then a week later, we're looking for racism to be solved, kind of thing. And so there's, I suppose, I sort of find that quite amusing, you know, but at the same time, I am part of an effort to work on that newfound awareness that a lot of people have been brought to, and to kind of use that to continue the education.
And we talk about this all the time, and I use this as an example when I do race equality and allyship training, you know, saying to Black colleagues, can I touch your hair? Now that hasn't been possible, thank goodness, for the most part of it because of us working remotely. But I just wonder, and we don't know the answer, but you know, and Emma Dabry's book, Don't Touch My Hair, will people still be doing that? Do you think there'll be more awareness? And I know it's a bit like putting your finger in the air and thinking, you know, I don't know how long's a piece of string, but I really hope that the information and the things that have been in mainstream magazines, as you mentioned, might shift that, and this kind of weird curiosity that people have with Black and African hair.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful that that penny has dropped. Really, really hopeful, because, you know, we're entitled to our sense of bodily integrity when we go out into the world, you know. It's, without permission, all of those things. In fact, in a strange sort of way, I wonder what the pandemic will have done to people's forwardness in terms of, you know, touching others in those racialized ways without consent. Yeah. Gosh, I hope so.
Yeah, and I mean, people often sound really shocked and they say, oh God, does that happen? And I said, it's happened to many of my Black friends and colleagues. So if you do see it happening, you know, just stop it immediately. If someone says you can touch my hair, that's one thing, but I still feel there's a lot of misinformation about it. And also, Rochelle, we've talked about questions like, oh, does Black skin tan? Does Asian skin go pale? You know, Candice Brathwaite talked about her experience of, in another podcast about Nobody Ever Told Me, Black motherhood, and how when Black pain is not believed, there's been the Embrace report about Black motherhood, particularly Black outcomes in terms of maternal outcomes. I don't want us to go down, you know, to be negative, but I just think it's so important, because this for me is part of this whole thing about beauty and wholeness. If we think about recovery, we think about pain, we think about healing, and how we can really get people to understand that.
Yeah, Candice Brathwaite's work is so important, and the statistics are incredibly alarming. And I think it just points to some amazing work that's been done recently, not only by academics actually, but I'm thinking of the novel The Confessions of Franny Langton. Spoiler alert, but she really, in that novel, oh dear, I forget the author's name, Sarah Collins, gives light, sheds light on the history of, you know, Black bodies at the start of the development of modern Western science, so to speak, being, you know, worked on without, we couldn't give consent as enslaved people to some extent, but also without anesthetic and things. And you know, the attitudes that Candice is throwing attention on now are a legacy of that, the way that we've always been used to develop science. You know, our bodies have been preserved for posterity to develop science, not necessarily with the care of us as people of colour at the forefront, quite the opposite of those scientists and early medics' minds. But yeah, I do think there's something of a legacy of that in terms of those awful statistics we read about where Black women are, I think, 4 times more likely to die in childbirth in the UK, and then Asian women, I think, depending on your ethnicity, it's something like twice as likely, I think, and I might be slightly misrepresenting those figures, but it's really alarming. But there's something about our pain not being believed and us being thought of more as objects to be worked on rather than, you know, full human beings. Sadly, it lingers, doesn't it?
I mean, I suppose the only thing I can take from it, Rochelle, is that people that might never have spoken about this, so not people like us, but are actually starting to speak about it and understand, and ask questions around, well, why are the health outcomes for Black communities, South Asian communities, Southeast Asian communities worse? We've still got a long way to go, but I feel like, you know, that was a niche fringe discussion, and now I feel like, I'm not saying it's forefront and center, but it's becoming more thought about. And so on that point, really, what does the term sort of Black beauty and wholeness mean to you?
Ooh, lovely question. Wholeness, that is such an interesting way of phrasing the question. And I think for me, it means something really challenging, which is an ongoing journey, I have to say, for me, but paying attention to all aspects of your life, looking after all aspects of your life. I don't mean all as in, you know, I don't want to make it sound like some awful chore, but just thinking about like yourself as a whole person who deserves and needs great relationships and fun and joy and play, as well as work and you know, feeding your intellectual drive and being in good health and all of those things. I think particularly for Black women, and I'm sure there are many parallels for Asian women as well, thinking about the cultures that we come from, we're so often expected, like our labor is just taken for granted, you know, our work is just taken for granted. We're expected to be working hard. It's what looks natural to so many people, even within our own communities. And so I think we have to be, I want to think of a better word than selfish, but I do think we have to be quite focused on our own wholeness.
Boundaried. Do you think boundaried is a better word? Yeah.
Right, yeah, boundaried. You know, recognizing where you are and being kind to yourself, being compassionate to yourself is so hard but so important.
And I think that's right. That point you said about there is, even in our own communities, how our labour can be taken for granted and how we're expected to graft, and that's just a standard.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to say that, actually, and that will resonate with many people from global majority diaspora cultures. And so how about then building on that, Rochelle, about culture and the concept of self-respect? So how, in your sense and from your specific aspect of Black British community, how do Black British women build themselves up in the face of subtle and obvious racism in your eyes? And we can also pick up on the legacy of the work of Claudia Jones.
Gosh, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, because one of the things that I was fascinated by when I began to look at the history of beauty culture in Black British and Caribbean communities, both in the Caribbean and then in Britain. So my book, many of the chapters deal with the Caribbean, and then they kind of follow those ideas to Britain, post-war Britain, and that generation of what we now refer to as Windrush settlers. You encounter a lot of respectability politics in that sort of, when you're researching that era and attitudes in that era. And again, the burden falls disproportionately on women, men as well, but women bear the brunt for respectability. And, you know, it's a sort of a prudishness that is just really, really important. It's tied to faith. But yeah, so self-respect can be a thorny one because it can kind of, I suppose, do you out of certain things. So having just talked about wholeness, you know, self-respect can kind of cut you off from your sexuality to some reason, not self-respect, but respectability.
Right.
Politics can kind of cut women off from their their sexuality and all of that. So it's difficult. Like, I think respecting yourself, I mean, it's lovely to be asked this question because it's really interesting to think about, but I think I wouldn't want to, I suppose my concept of self-respect, if I were talking to like my Black British women peers, would be sort of allowing yourself your fullness and your wholeness, and not going down that rabbit hole, I suppose, for me in particular, of self-respect meaning some kind of stuffy old idea about respectability that means you know, we've got a very buttoned up British Caribbean culture can be really kind of like, you know, like really damning of women. Like saying someone's got no self-respect can be a real insult. So I'd like to say that, I suppose, tying it to your original question about Black beauty and self-respect, is for those who want to like play in beauty. I grew up loving beauty culture, for all that I knew that there was all sorts of problematic things going on with it, and I had a real sense of colorism in our community growing up. Me and my older sister, wow, we just loved playing with makeup and fashion and style. And so maybe Black beauty can be a great way to access, you know, a strong sense of self. You know, I just offer it. It's not for everyone. Some people quite understandably reject the oppressive politics of you know, beauty and politics of Black femininity. I mean, I myself, this last year, it's been wonderful in the sense that I haven't really worn, I don't mean to be glib, obviously it hasn't been wonderful what we've been living through, but in terms of like how my relationship with makeup has changed, my God, I'm now really into skincare, but hardly bother with makeup. So I hope that makes sense, Layla. I just around the houses there.
No, I think, and I guess that's an interesting point there, but I didn't really think about it from the angle of respectability politics and, you know, being pure, being virginal, being with one person. I think of it as I respect myself. I have autonomy to make choices. And in terms of subtle and obvious racism, so things that are said in the workplace, like, oh, you know, is that a professional hairstyle? Predominantly said to Black women and men in the workplace, for example. I mean, some of it's subtle, some of it's very obvious. And I guess I wanted to ask around, you know, we're very resilient as global majority diaspora communities. And I think it's more about, it's not about resilience, it's about people being very aware of their words and the impact that they have. But given the legacy of all that, how do people build themselves up despite of those disgusting comments and things that happen and confront their identity and their sense of beauty?
Gosh, it's so hard, isn't it? Another great thing I read early on in the pandemic was about Black women who hadn't styled their own hair before and were suddenly doing it and really getting into it and enjoying, you know, just kind of lavishing some time and attention on themselves, and how important that can be. I'm fortunate myself. I've not really worked in workplace cultures that were so oppressive that you couldn't, you know, come as you are with whatever hairstyle you had at that time. But I know how prevalent it is in you know, in corporate cultures and things.
I totally hear you about respectability politics, which I hadn't thought of. And the way that I was thinking about this was, it's not about putting the resilience badge on Black communities or people that have experienced subtle and obvious racism in the workplace and outside of it. But despite the things that might have been said to them, how we retain that, how, you know, many people who identify as being part of the Black community retain that sense of, I respect myself, I respect my choices and my wholeness and my beauty.
I wonder, I feel this is such a great question, because it's leading me to go to unexpected places as well, because what you're saying is making me think of the time I spent as a little girl being cared for by my mum, like every week when she would style my hair for school for the week, and how I knew that sort of beauty culture could be quite a sort of nourishing place. And then I remember reading about Black women who unexpectedly found themselves caring for their own hair at home in the absence of being able to go to a stylist and have that lovely pampering that you can have from a professional. And just, it can be a time to sort of commune with yourself. And so when you get these attacks on your person where someone sort of says something about your hair, perhaps in a work setting or something, hopefully, you've got that foundation of knowing that caring for yourself is part of that wholeness, and everybody makes decisions about their grooming, whether they think they're, completely aloof to all of that or really, really into it and they're a beauty junkie. I think everybody really makes decisions about how they want to look and how they want to appear. And I think lavishing some time on yourself can be partly the antidote to, the hostility that the world can sometimes still show Black women's bodies and Black men, and how we choose to style our hair and all of that stuff. And I'm thinking particularly about what you said about the hostility of some workplace cultures where we're told it's unprofessional or or people want to put their hands in our hair and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm hardly I feel like I'm not exactly the guru who can preach about these things, but at the same time, like, I certainly have found it quite edifying to spend a certain amount of time, like, some quiet time, lavishing attention on my hair. It's really it's a nice thing to do. I often listen to great podcasts while I'm doing it.
Top tip there. You also mentioned colorism, Rochelle, which is, again, huge in the South Asian community. It's just vile. So colorism is where people of lighter skin shades within global majority diaspora communities are seen as more beautiful. They might have advantages in certain families or to certain things, or I'm speaking from a South Asian perspective here. They are often told they're more beautiful than siblings or cousins that have darker skin, again, based on this perception of race, hierarchy, colonialism, and how light skins were more favoured. And it is really problematical. And I don't know if you have any thoughts. I feel like we're only starting the conversation now, really, in South Asian communities, in many South Asian communities. And, what can we do to have these conversations as diaspora people, as global majority people around this, and debunking these myths and just stopping this nonsense, in effect?
I know it's horrible to think of the different permutations of it in different communities. It's certainly rife in African diaspora communities. It's not uniform, it's not the same. No. And there's so many. The reason I wrote the book was because I was so heartened to find so many counter-cultural kind of responses to it, with lots of people of colour, Black people defying it. I wanted to show that Black beauty had a history, and that's one of the ways I think we can tackle it, is we can show, look, these ideas are old. Colorism is old. It repeats itself. It seems to feed on itself with every new generation. But actually, people have been tackling and protesting these ideas for a really long time. And although they were very problematic, some of these beauty competitions, it's interesting to go back and see that in Jamaica, from the earliest all-white beauty competitions, there were people decrying them as not authentic and as racist, and often they were Black feminist voices as well. And then in the 60s, you see a whole tranche of Black beauty competitions that were, in many ways problematic, and often they were tied to work identities, I found. So you had the competitions like Miss Civil Service.
Okay.
Very much placed Black women in particular kinds of categories, but they were nonetheless celebrations of deep-toned Black women. And so, the contemporaries of that time were saying, enough already. We want to see ourselves reflected in beauty and beauty culture, and we know we're beautiful, so put us on stage. And it's important to know that history, because we do tend to approach it as though it were some kind of new thing, and I think it's easier to begin to tackle it by understanding that it's old. It has various links to the way that power showed up in our societies. So, in Caribbean history, it's very much tied to the history of colonialism, enslavement, empire, and trying to get some kind of proximity to the ruling class, I suppose, and wanting the best for your children, and understanding that privilege was tied up with light skin and essentially whiteness. And so it's just really tough, but it's important to know that it has a history, and it's not just some spontaneous thing that sprang up here in 2021, you know.
Yeah. It's how the conversations go, though, isn't it? So that the way, I think sometimes the way in which the conversations are being had now feels new, but you're absolutely right. You know, I can only talk about from my perspective, but this concept is not new, sadly.
Yeah.
And of course, these have an impact on people's mental health and well-being, the things that we've spoken about. So what do you think workplaces can do to talk about race, identity, mental health and well-being more in your eyes? Are there ways in which we should be having the conversation, we could be having the conversation? What do you think might work?
Yeah, I think it's important to upskill staff. Something that I'm involved in my work is training leaders and managers to enhance their race literacy, so that if a traumatized person of color is seeking out some support and they're suffering a situation at work that is everything to do with race, or is, you know, mired in race, that they're talking to people who are competent and able to have those conversations with them rather than sweeping it under the carpet. I think there's so much mask wearing that we have to do, and some of it is just about being, you know, professional at work, but we should be able to speak of our experience when we're coming up against institutional racism and those kinds of barriers. If we're going to give voice to them, the person on the other end of the conversation, be they, you know, of any ethnicity, whether global majority or white, they do need to be able to not run screaming from that conversation, but to meet it. That would be a start. So yeah, speaking the language of racialization, understanding that it is a very real part of our experience, and that in order to tackle it, we have to be able to talk about it.
Those are really helpful tips, Rochelle, especially your point about, you know, you shouldn't go running screaming, that there needs to be training. People need to take that training on to say, okay, I've never been through what you've been through, maybe I have, about listening, about saying, okay, what are the support mechanisms in place? I think that's hugely helpful. And you're an incredibly busy person, an academic, a writer, you work on leadership programs. So, Rochelle, how do you look after your own mental health, and what are your top 3 tips?
Oh, it's so nice to be asked that. Thank you, because it's reflective for me. It makes me think, actually, what do? I think I have to know my triggers. You know, you and I like to talk a lot about sleep and how our sleep is doing. And I know that I have to look after my sleep. I remember when I was researching my doctorate, I like many graduate students, I became very anxious about things and did so much research and thinking. I discovered, in fact, a good friend helped me to discover knitting, which I'd learned as a child, but it was just so wonderful to have a hobby that was creative and allowed you to work with your hands, and kind of took me out of my head, which was really necessary. So I would say one of my tips is find some creative play, whether it's, I don't know, gardening or any kind of artistic pursuit that you enjoy, or, you know, knitting. And I don't just say that because it's hip and trendy. It is also, you know, I get a lot of joy from just wool and picking out nice wool and then following a pattern. Yeah, so that's one tip, finding some kind of hobby. And again, going back to our conversation about wholeness, recognizing that part of you needs to be fed as well. I've also begun to realize lately that I need to make sure there's some joy in every day, because I can be very work oriented. And in recent years, since meeting my partner, I've really learned to, you know, like put a lot of the fun back, because I'm, you know, I like to think of myself as a very, you know, fun person. But I can be so work oriented, and I don't fetishize that anymore. I don't think, oh yeah, it's really great just to be like, you know, just really, really driven about work. So I make sure there's like some movement and some laughter and fun in my day. In this lockdown 3, I've been really into like fun dance videos that you can do online. Oh my gosh, it's so great to just your own little dance party. And I know I'm not alone in that. I've got some friends who love to do that as well. And, you know, I just sort of laugh my head off and enjoy a good dance. And then my third tip would be outdoorsiness, which is incredibly challenging at the moment, finding some time to get outdoors. And I'm really lucky that I live somewhere quite green and spacious. But I just think, for looking after my mental health anyway, which is what you asked me about, I do need to get out there and see some big skies often, you know. So a little walk works wonders. That the way it changes your perspective. If you've been thinking deeply about a particular idea or problem for a while, you know, it's a cliche, but a little walk can do wonders. And I know it's difficult at this time when so many of us are afraid of the pandemic and COVID and what you encounter when you go outdoors. But nonetheless, I think, you know, with the various safeguards in place, it's really important to still get yourself that fresh air.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. Just going out for a walk does really help if you can drag yourself away. And I also know that you're an open water swimmer, aren't you, Rochelle?
Yeah. Which is a massive surprise to me. I did not see that coming.
So much so that one of our colleagues called you Ariel, didn't she?
Oh my God. I didn't know that, actually. That's quite funny. But yeah, no, that was an accidental discovery. We live by the sea, and I started going last summer and really enjoying it because it just looked irresistible as we had a nice warm summer. And then it carried me right through winter. And I was like, this is crazy. I'm still going in the sea. I was in on Christmas Day. So madness, but I love it. It really does give you such a spring in your step.
Brilliant. And thank you so much, Rochelle. It's been brilliant speaking to you and talking about topics that we might not always have an opportunity to talk about in the workplace, but how workplaces can do this and open up the conversation. So if people want to know more about your work, how should they contact you?
They should go to rochelleroe.com, my website, where they can find out more about my writing. And I am on the Twitter scape as well. I'm at Dr._Rochelle Roe. But thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. And just, our conversation's taken us in all sorts of directions I hadn't anticipated, which is brilliant.
And thank you. And don't forget to check out Rochelle's links and get in contact with her. I'll put them in the show notes. And I'll also put the link into the previous podcasts that she's been on, because I would say definitely check those out. And thank you so much. And don't forget to join us next week where we'll be carrying on our personal development week. Take care and stay safe until next time. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.